Wow, this is Mook Spring. It's so beautiful and green.
Yes, the water is incredibly clear.
Ah, I'm so glad we came here.
The tourist's phone lifted at
I'm
Mook
just worried
Spring,
about what's next.
aimed straight
Don't
at
worry, we'll
Nye.
figure it out together.
She was 6 years
You're
old,
right.
laughing in the water, completely unaware someone was about to turn her joy into content. James stepped between camera and
Sir,
daughter
please
without
stop.
raising
Leave
his
her alone.
voice.
Please don't feel my child.
Please don't film my child.
Okay, I won't. I'm sorry.
The phone lowered. But in that moment, their U.S.
We must change
partner
course
watching
immediately.
nearby made a decision
It's a
that would
risk.
change the
Without leaving.
contract.
Trust me.
I hope
Have
you're
you ever
right.
had to protect a grandchild's
Welcome to Mook Spring,
happiness
Vietnam.
from a stranger's camera?
Please like and subscribe.
It helps us share important stories.
Thank you.
Hello, and welcome back. When you're building something valuable, the hardest test isn't proving you can work hard. It's proving you can protect joy while doing it. That morning in Quang Binh, the happiest thing wasn't the caves. It was Nai. She was 6 now, which meant she woke up with a plan whether the adults were ready or not. She marched into the room wearing her little headlamp like a crown and announced, "Today we do adventure, but not the scary adventure, the fun one." James blinked like he'd just been assigned a new job title. "Yes, ma'am," he said, completely serious. Diep tried to look calm and responsible, but she laughed. Because for once, the world felt light. James's mother came out of her room with a backpack that looked like she'd packed for a week. James raised an eyebrow. "We're gone for the day, not moving countries." She didn't even flinch. "Mothers don't pack for time," she replied. "We pack for surprise." Nye nodded like that made perfect sense. "Surprise happens," she said wisely. Because of that wisdom, everyone relaxed slightly. Even their U.S. partner laughed when they met in the lobby. No cameras, no big corporate voice. Just comfortable clothes, good shoes, and that polite energy that said they were here to enjoy the day and not make it weird. The procurement lead crouched slightly and said, "So you're the explorer?" Noi studied him like she was deciding if he was allowed on her team. Then she pointed at his shoes and said, "You have good walking feet." James choked on a laugh. "She approves," he told him. So they started with the riverboat to Phong Nha cave, because Nai had demanded a boat first. The boat station was busy, sunny, and full of families. The river moved slow and calm, and the mountains looked like they were posing for pictures without trying. Nai sat right in the middle like a captain, hair blowing everywhere, shouting, "Look, water! Look, big rock!" James sat behind her, with one hand lightly on her back, not holding her tight, just making sure she could feel safe enough to be wild. Diep leaned into the breeze and realized her shoulders were down, like her body finally believed they weren't in danger. Halfway down the river, Nai pointed at a water buffalo near the shore and gasped, "That cow is doing a bath." James smiled. "That's basically the best life," he said. The U.S. partner laughed and said, "Honestly, same." That shared laughter felt like progress. When they reached the cave entrance, the air got cooler fast. Nai stepped inside and froze like she'd walked into another planet. "Mom," she whispered, "the mountain has air conditioning." James covered his mouth like he was trying not to laugh too loud in the cave. They walked through the cave zone tourists could visit, and Ni turned every rock into a story. "That one looks like a sleeping dragon. That one looks like a grandma nose. That one is definitely a secret door." James's mother leaned close to Diep and said softly, "She makes everything less scary." Diep nodded. "She makes everything more alive," because Nai made everything lighter. The group moved through the cave with ease. After the boat tour, they drove to Paradise Cave, because someone had said it was the pretty one, and Nai immediately decided that meant it was her favorite. The stairs were the only part she didn't love. At step number 20, she stopped, hands on hips, and said, "I need a snack break. For my legs." James handed her a cracker like it was official medical treatment. "Doctor approved," he told her. Nye nodded, satisfied, and continued like she'd been paid. Inside Paradise Cave, the boardwalk stretched into a wide, glowing space, and Nye's mouth dropped open. "Okay," she whispered. "This is very pretty." The U.S. quality director leaned toward James and said, smiling, "So this is what you call high standards?" James nodded, dead serious. "Exactly. We learned from the cave." Nui turned around like she'd heard her name. "The cave is the boss," she announced. Everyone laughed again. That announcement seemed to settle something in the air, a shared understanding that quality mattered, even in joy. At lunch, they ate simple local food, warm, filling, and exactly what tired feet needed. Nye sat in the middle of the table and declared she was hosting a meeting. "Welcome," she said, waving her spoon. "We talk about happiness." James covered his face. "She's better than us at business," he muttered. The procurement lead played along perfectly. "I agree," he said. "All agenda items must be joyful." Nye nodded. "Yes, and also dessert." So after lunch, they went to Mook Spring because Nye had heard the word spring and thought it meant jumping. The place was bright green. The water was so clear it looked fake, and the wooden walkways made it feel like a secret garden. Nye dipped one toe in, screamed like it was a surprise attack, then laughed so hard she almost fell over. "It's ice!" she yelled. James rolled up his pants and stepped in like a brave dad. Then he made a face. "It is actually ice," he admitted. Diep stepped in too, because if the kids were doing it, moms did it too. The cold hit her bones, and she gasped. Nye pointed at her and laughed. "Mom made a fish face!" James's mother sat on the bench, laughing quietly, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look like she was carrying the whole past on her shoulders. She just looked like a grandmother watching a child be happy. That happiness lasted exactly 14 more minutes. Then a tourist approached, phone already lifted, aimed at Nye splashing in the water. Diep's stomach tightened immediately. She started to move forward, but James was faster. He stepped between the camera and Nye without raising his voice, calm but unmovable. "Please don't film my child," he said. The tourist hesitated, confused. "It's just for memories." "Not our memories," James said firmly. "Please lower the phone." The tourist's face reddened, embarrassed. The phone dropped. "Sorry," she muttered, backing away. James stayed there a moment longer, making sure she actually left. Then he turned back to Nye, who was completely oblivious, still hunting for perfect rocks. But the U.S. partner had seen everything. The quality director stood a few feet away, watching James with an expression Diep couldn't quite read. Not judgment, something else. Respect, maybe. Or confirmation. The procurement lead walked over slowly and spoke quietly enough that Nye wouldn't hear. "That's the second time I've seen you do that," he said. "Protect without performing." James met his eyes. "It's not optional," he said simply. "She's 6. She didn't consent to being content." The man nodded slowly. "Most people don't protect like that," he said. "Most people negotiate. You just hold the line." James didn't soften. Because the line matters more than the deal. The procurement lead's expression shifted. Something decided, clicking into place. "That's exactly why the deal works," he said quietly. Then he stepped back, giving James space. Diep felt her chest loosen slightly. That moment, that quiet exchange, had just changed something. She wasn't sure what yet, but she felt it. Nai ran up, dripping and delighted, holding a smooth rock. "Look, I found treasure." James crouched and examined it seriously. "That's premium quality," he told her. Nai beamed. "I'm keeping it forever." Sometimes the most important contracts aren't signed in offices. They're proven in the small moments when no one's watching except the people who matter. On the drive back to the lodge, Nai fell asleep in the car with her headlamp still on her forehead, mouth open in the most peaceful way. James looked at her like he was saving the image in his heart. Diep leaned her head against the seat and felt something simple and rare. Joy with no cost. Back at the lodge, they carried Nai inside like she was made of glass. James tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Tomorrow is grown-up work. Tonight is just you." James's mother adjusted the blanket and looked at Diep. "Thank you for letting us have this," she said. Diep answered honestly, voice quiet. "Thank you for keeping it gentle." Downstairs, the contract summary sat in James's folder, untouched. The U.S. partner didn't push it. They didn't even mention it. And that made the whole day feel even safer, like respect was part of the deal, not a fight. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, the procurement lead sent James a short message. "Tomorrow after Doong, let's talk contract terms. I want to add something." James showed Diep. Her eyebrows lifted. "Add what?" James shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet, but after today, I think it's good." The message stayed on James's mind through the entire Doong expedition. 4 days underground, climbing, river crossings, camping in the cave's massive chambers. And the whole time, a quiet question traveled with him. What did the partner want to add? When they emerged from the cave on the 4th day, tired and humbled by the earth, James checked his phone. One new message from the procurement lead. "Back safe? Ready to talk tomorrow morning. Bring Diep. This affects the whole family." Diep read it over his shoulder. "That affects the whole family," she repeated slowly. "That's either very good or very careful." James nodded. "We'll find out tomorrow." That night, back at the lodge, Nai climbed into their bed and wouldn't let go. "You left too long," she said, voice small. James held her close. "I know," he whispered. "I didn't like it either." Nai pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Next time, shorter." "Deal," James promised. Because of that promise, the next morning felt different. Not rushed, intentional. James's mother made breakfast while Nai sat at the table drawing a picture of the family when everyone is home. At 9:30, the U.S. partner arrived at their lodge room. No conference table, no formal setup, just tea and the contract folder on the coffee table. The procurement lead sat down and started simply. "First, thank you for the cave trip. Both of them." He smiled at Nee, who was coloring in the corner. "Especially for teaching us about happiness meetings." Nee looked up, pleased. "You're welcome." Then he turned back to James and Diep, his face shifting to something more serious, but not cold. "We've been talking internally," he said, "about what we saw at Mook Spring." Diep's stomach tightened slightly. The man continued. "The way you protected your daughter. No negotiation, no performance, just a clear line. That told us more about your operation than any packhouse tour could." James stayed quiet, listening. So the procurement lead opened the folder and pulled out a single page. a contract addendum. "We want to add a family protection clause," he said, binding on both sides. Diep leaned forward. "What does that mean?" The quality director spoke up, voice calm. "It means we formalize what you've been doing instinctively. No filming minors, no home content, no behind-the-scenes family requests. And if anyone in our network violates it, internal or external, there's an immediate penalty, and you have the right to pause shipments until it's resolved." James blinked. "You're protecting us in writing?" The procurement lead nodded. "We're protecting the partnership," he corrected gently. "Because if you can't protect your family, you can't protect quality. And we need both." Diep felt her throat tighten. This wasn't a concession. This was respect turned into structure. James read the clause carefully, then passed it to Diep. She read it twice. The language was clear, direct, enforceable. It covered everything they'd been afraid to ask for, and more. "This is," Diep's voice caught, "this is more than we expected." The procurement lead smiled faintly. "You've earned more than you expected," he said. "Consistently, quietly. That's rare." Nai looked up from her drawing. "Are we signing something?" she asked. James turned to her. "We're making a deal that keeps you safe," he said simply. Nai nodded, like that made perfect sense. "Good," she said. Then she went back to coloring. Because Nai trusted them completely, James and Diep felt steadier. James picked up the pen. "Before I sign," he said, "I need to confirm one thing. This clause, does it apply to future products, future partnerships, everything?" "Everything," the quality director confirmed. "As long as we work together, your family stays private, non-negotiable." James looked at Diep. She nodded once, so James signed. Then Diep signed. The procurement lead and quality director signed as witnesses. The contract was done. No champagne, no photo op. Just a quiet exchange of papers and a handshake that felt like a promise being kept on both sides. The procurement lead stood. "We'll send the executed copy tonight," he said. "First shipment under the new terms starts in 2 weeks." James nodded. "We'll be ready." As the partner team left, the quality director paused at the door and looked back at Ni, still drawing peacefully. "She's lucky to have you," he said quietly. Diep smiled, tired but real. "We're lucky to have her." After they left, James sat down heavily on the couch, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for months. "We did it," he said softly. Diep sat beside him. "We did it without losing anything that matters." James's mother appeared from the kitchen with tea, moving quietly as always. She set the cups down and surprised them by speaking. "I'm proud of you both," she said simply. Then she walked back to the kitchen before they could respond. Noi abandoned her drawing and climbed into James's lap. "Can we go to the beach now?" she asked. "I made a list." James laughed, the sound loose and relieved. "What's on the list?" Nai counted on her fingers. "Ocean, ice cream, no phone, souvenir, everyone happy." Diep looked at James. He looked back at her. Then, without hesitation, James pulled out his phone and turned it off. Not silent. Off. "Today is your day," he told Nai. "Boss's orders." So they went to the coast, near Doong Hoi. The ocean did what oceans do. Made everything feel smaller in the best way. Nai ran straight to the water, stopped right at the edge, and yelled, "I'm not scared!" Like she was convincing herself and the sea at the same time. James's mother sat under shade with a small bag of snacks and watched Nai build a sand fruit shop. Nye arranged shells like oranges and announced, "This one is premium." James crouched beside her. "What's the price?" "2 hugs," Nye said without hesitation. James gave her 1 hug and pretended to bargain for the second. Nye laughed so hard, she fell backward into the sand. Diep watched them and felt something painful loosen in her chest. Not because life became perfect, because life became theirs again. 1 tea. Later, they got ice cream. Nye chose mango and insisted James's mother take the first bite to prove it's safe. James's mother laughed, quietly, sincerely, and did it. On the walk back, Nye found a tiny souvenir keychain shaped like a lantern and said, "This is for our house, not the shop." That sentence mattered, because the shop was public. The house was sacred. That evening, back at the lodge, James's phone stayed off. No emails, no reminders, no pressure. Just a family eating simple food together, while Nye told elaborate stories about her sand shop and the very important Shell customers. James's mother cleared the dishes and paused at the table. "This is what I wanted for him," she said softly, looking at James. "Not big, just whole." Diep reached over and squeezed her hand once. "Thank you for staying," she said. James's mother nodded, eyes wet but smiling. After Nye fell asleep that night, curled around her new lantern keychain, James and Diep stood on the small balcony looking out at the dark mountains. "We start shipments in 2 weeks," James said quietly. "We're ready," Diep replied. James turned to her. "And if it gets hard again?" Diep smiled. "We remember today," she said. "We remember Nye laughing in the sand. We remember the contract that protects her. We remember we already chose what matters." James pulled her close. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too," she whispered back. Inside, Nye's soft breathing filled the room. Outside, the mountains stood steady under stars, and somewhere in a folder on the table, a signed contract promised that growth and protection could exist together, not as opposites, but as partners. The next morning, they packed to go home. Nye wore her headlamp one last time and declared, "This was the best vacation in my whole life." James lifted her up. "Mine too," he said. At the airport, James finally turned his phone back on. Messages loaded slowly. One stood out from the procurement lead. "Safe travels. See you at the pack house in 2 weeks. The family protection clause starts now." James showed Diep. She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. On the plane home, Nye fell asleep holding her lantern keychain. James's mother dozed quietly across the aisle, and James and Diep sat in peaceful silence, fingers linked, watching clouds roll past the window. They'd gone underground. They'd climbed mountains. They'd signed a contract that would change their business. But the real victory was simpler. They'd learned how to grow without breaking. They'd learned how to protect joy while building something lasting. And they were going home, not to rest, but to keep going. Together, protected, whole. Have you ever built something meaningful without sacrificing the people you love? Sometimes the best business decision isn't about profit. It's about drawing lines that keep your family sacred.